Yes, so due to technical difficulties, we can't broadcast to Facebook right now. We'll be recording so we can upload later on. But either way, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. And we'll be discussing security because, of course, that's the main topic nowadays. Joining us this morning is Justinas Mickus, Associate Analyst at the Eastern Europe Studies Center, Justinas, and Viggo Jakobsen from the Royal Danish Defence College. Hello, Peter. The basic outline of how this will work is we'll have the introductory part by Justinas, then Peter, and then a short Q&A. So if you have any questions, have them ready for the very end. For the time being, I think, Justinas, you can start us off.
All right, well, thank you so much. And yeah, nice to see you again, Peter. Yeah, so the webinar today is on a paper that I had a pleasure to prepare, but it is important, that the content generated in the paper that's now available on the think tank website, the content was generated by by the representatives of the 9 Baltic Sea region states, which include all the Nordics, all the Baltics plus Poland and Germany, and the representatives being both official representatives from the Defense Ministry, from the government side, as well as the expert community, the think tank, Analyst circle. And the exercise, comes with certain limitations, but with certain strengths as well. Trying to capture something that's a consensus or an approximate consensus creates a risk of, lowest common denominator sort of findings. But at the same time, it is useful as a repeated iterative process, which I really hope this will be. So with these 2 caveats, I would like to just very, very quickly overview the main sort of contents and the main, I guess, tensions and insights discussed in the paper. And then I'll hand over to Peter because he shared with us the presentation he's prepared, and I don't want to, repeat what he will be saying, and a lot of the insights that I think are crucial to the paper will be covered by Peter as well. So for me, I'll do a more bird's eye view of the whole piece. So the so-called Building Baltic Consensus paper, the report, essentially contains 2 parts. It first presents a shared assessment of the strategic context in which the Baltic region finds itself today. And second, it then outlines the shared positions, the positions on which all the people involved in the debate could agree, as well as pointing out some areas where there were either disagreements or need for further discussion. So it is assessment and then positions, and so descriptive and normative. And in both both of the parts have the same essential topical structure, substantive structure, covering the dynamics and the I guess priorities relating to the Russian aggression on Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine, then the changing intra-regional and intra-regional security cooperation dynamics, as well as the regional cooperation dynamics in the Baltic. And then lastly, sort of discussing what the Baltic Sea regional security situation and priorities will be given the broader underlying global changes taking place in the world today. And in all of these 3 topics, we have a few, I think, defining tensions that are really worth probing, and I'm sure Peter will touch upon them, and then maybe in the Q&A, we will have a chance to address them as well. And the key tensions and the solutions that are offered us as follows. So for the Russian war on Ukraine part, I mean, I think that content there, for those who've already had a chance to read the paper, who will be reading, content there is probably least surprising. And that's largely because that was the topic number one of the year, and we've all been covering it further. But the paper reaffirms the commitment to seeing that Russia does not win this war, and that Ukraine gets to set the terms of the peace. And then it simultaneously, as it expresses, it reaffirms this commitment. It highlights the tension between what that commitment necessitates, what it entails in terms of support for Ukraine, in terms of making sure that it is in the position to set the terms for peace, and the capacity, both in terms of a long-term sustained military support, as well as the sustainability of the political support, material support, non-lethal support for Ukraine, in the West. So there is this tension between commitment and capacity. It's not the capacity constraints come in different forms. It comes from one, the sort of inherited underinvestment in defense capabilities that now limit the capability to provide sustained and offensive weapons to Ukraine. A, B, fragile to some extent and wary domestic populations that put a political constraint on escalating support for Ukraine, and driving the need for a quicker resolution that may not be fitting the terms that the commitment says we should aim for. So that's the main tension, and the Baltic answer to this tension is, as you would expect, it is that we must be very, very smart about the capacity constraints in terms of the rising public fatigue. We have to understand the different thresholds for suffering and address them through our both through our government communications, official communications, as well as tailored support and amelioration measures. At the same time, in terms of the constraints on our material capacity, we have to utilize leverage economies of scale, as well as NATO long-term industrial planning capabilities to set up dedicated supply chains for supporting Ukraine. And we really have to go above and beyond to make sure that within these constraints on our capacity, we can find a way to fulfill our commitment. This is not easy, but the Baltics seem quite strongly united on this point. And that is how they narrate and, resolve, or at least point to the resolution of the tension. So that's number one. Number two is regional security, and that covers two parts. One is what is the regional security landscape in the first place, and second, what are the implications of that changing environment on intra-regional cooperation perspectives. And here, I would say that the main tension can be cast in two ways. But the primary way, I think, is a strong sense of tensions of gaining new strengths, the Baltic region gaining new strengths with the coming accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO, with a much stronger will by most countries in the region to invest in defense and to rethink their security arrangements, and most notably, already earmarked with material commitments in Germany and Poland and many other countries. So new strengths and new mobilization versus old vulnerabilities, which remain. This is a tension that defines the discussion held in September, and that made its way to the paper now. But the further tension is it's related. It's that the new strengths that the Baltic region may get through added strategic depth for the Baltics, through changing the understanding of the Baltic Sea from something of a buffer zone that creates a sense of uncertainty whether the more Western regional states would come into aid to the Baltic states in time, changing it from this kind of a barrier to a strategic link, opening many more new opportunities to quickly and effectively support the most vulnerable parts of the region. So on the one hand, we have these strengths, and on the other hand, we have new vulnerabilities for Russia. And that itself is also a tension that will, as I saw, Peter will discuss at length. But the point here being is that if we, and it seems like the Baltic states, this is the we to which I refer, currently do believe that materially Russian power will be constrained in the future. There are many signs to that. But politically, the political attitude and behavior of Russia is very unlikely to change from within in the immediate to medium term that is politically relevant future. Then the changing security landscape in the Baltic states with new strengths in the Baltic region, with new strengths for the NATO members and the NATO presence in the region, and new vulnerabilities created for Russia. We can think of the Kola Peninsula, we can think of the 360 surrounding of Kaliningrad. That actually only increases the prospects of security dilemmas in the region going wrong, whether through miscommunication, through unwarranted aggression on the Kremlin side, preventive attacks, etc. And this requires a very smart way to go about it. As I said, nuke strengths don't negate necessarily old vulnerabilities, and they also, by creating new vulnerabilities for Russia, increase a chance, the probability of an undesirable attack, which is not constrained by the material decline of Russia, which most countries expect, simply because the current war shows that Russia is more than capable of waging a quick, aggressive, highly destructive war when it does not necessarily have a prospect of a long-term sustained strategic victory. So that's the second point, is that there are many things we're promised to gain through the new developments in the Baltic Sea regional cooperation, but we will have to think about how to navigate them smartly. And there are many, obviously, many actions we can take to realize this opportunity. Not all of it is material. A lot of it is more carefully planning and more thoughtfully planning on how we deploy our capabilities, how many of them. But obviously, there is a strong understanding that the material presence of NATO forces would also have to be increased. And the way that's being handled, again, I hope and I saw that Peter will cover that, so I won't step on that topic, but that's the second tension that I wanted to highlight. And the third one, the third topic is, of course, the global dimension. And here, again, the tension is maybe twofold. One is more subtle. The discussion on the global changes in the international environment is, again, as one expects, it's the big mega trends are all there. It's the global power shifts towards the global east and to some extent to the global south, in particular the rise of China, which drives then to some extent the emerging systemic competition between Western democracies and autocratic regimes led by Beijing, or primarily in the form of Beijing. That's the one megatrend shaping the global environment. Climate change and technological transformation are the close second and third. And altogether, they raise the main tension being how does the key pillar of the Western alliance, the US, respond? And obviously the discourse is again between, overstretching the United States when it stays committed in Europe versus when it necessarily needs to get more involved in East Asia versus a straight up pivot to East Asia. And the uncertainties around that creates the tension where the Baltic Sea regional states are clear, unequivocally committed to a continued US presence in the region, not necessarily on the same scale as now, recognizing the imperatives for change. But while they remain committed and remain invested in maintaining the US presence in the region, there is a deep, unproductive uncertainty about how the US will look like in the future, both in the short-term future with the new political changes, potential political changes in 2024, but going forward with increasing, demands on its presence in East Asia. But also on how to navigate the change without upsetting in the moment, the current arrangements of burden sharing, the undermining the trust in transatlantic allies, as well as how to sort of link up the security cooperation, which does seem by and large more solid, with other potentially sensitive but also relevant areas of transatlantic cooperation, primarily in the political economy sphere, trade, technology, etc. So that's the one big tension. And the second one is closely parallel. That is, when you think about the Baltic Sea region from the global perspective, there seems to be a differentiation between how different countries in the region understand the situation based on whether their understanding of the global trends and of the global changes is first filtered through the regional first perspective, which is arguably the case in the Baltic states, where even though they are very involved in, or increasingly involved in the Indo-Pacific region, the involvement is primarily driven by the desire to show that we care for our main allies, that we're good partners there, so that they continue to be present and involved in the region. On the one hand, that's the perspective, the region first perspective on the global politics. And the second one, which is regional countries, regional powers that are at the same time, and to some extent even more, involved in other geopolitical regions or political geographical regions. And that is probably most visible in a sense of Germany, but also to some extent the Nordic countries, which, while very, very concerned with the Baltic region's security, also have a separate, related but separate security theater in the Arctic. And the different theaters create different demands for cooperation, sometimes driving to more pragmatic engagement, sometimes to a more confrontational, containment-based one, but also on the optimal allocation of limited resources, and that is at the present moment strongly felt in Germany, which, given both its geographical position as well as the sort of political weight in the EU, is inescapably involved in all of the major EU security theaters, and wants to be smart about how to match the current levels of its capabilities with the ever-growing commitments and successful synergies with the partners. So these are the tensions, and I hope that for all of them, the answers have been provided. I think I can combine the regional cooperation cluster of issues and the global cooperation cluster of issues by saying that it seems that in both cases, moderation and a sort of common sense driven pragmatic approach has been what the shared consensus position of the Baltic states has proven itself to be, specifically that there's a strong sense that while there are great synergies to be gained from regional cooperation, regionalization is not the key. So we will always think of how we can strengthen the region within the larger European and transatlantic security architecture, maintaining the continued involvement of our allies while we take on more of a burden ourselves, so that the commitment, the continued presence of our allies is less costly to them. At the same time, trying to include some of the allies that are maybe a little less involved, including France, so that there is a alliance-wide greater understanding of the regional security problems and dynamics. So avoiding regionalization while getting the specific gains promised by closer inter-regional cooperation, prioritizing practical and relatively easier to achieve cooperation projects first. That is clarifying defense planning and threat assessment structures before committing to costly long-term infrastructure development, while of course those two things will happen parallel, but taking care of these foundational strategic level misalignments first, and as I said before, maintaining the balance between the absolute need to be able to deny a quick attack by a potential threat, in this case Russia, which is more than willing, seems to wage a destructive campaign, while also not upsetting the security dilemma situation to such an extent that our strengths themselves become a cause of concern. And I am certain, as I speak and as I was writing this paper, that such resolutions of the tensions that I've observed, that I've discussed in the paper, are not a voice or the position of any one specific country, meaning that there will be slight disagreements from any one of the participants or any one of the countries represented with the position that ostensibly is the shared Baltic one. And I take it as an inevitable consequence of this exercise, but I don't take it as necessarily a bad thing, in a sense that capturing this balanced and in some cases maybe cautious, in some cases maybe stronger than some countries would subscribe to position, is a very, very good jumping off point for much more specific and much more concrete, and in that sense a little bit more incisive discussions on specific subsets of questions, for example. Right, so we need to have dedicated supply lines to increase our support for Ukraine. How is that best arranged? Who takes the lead, etc. That's a conversation that can happen more productively after you solidify and you can refer to a working consensus. And so I hope for the other questions as well, this paper can become this reference point, which leads me then to a shared hope. I know that this is not necessarily a very analytical content, but in terms of how we work with this further, I really hope that that this becomes a first and an iterative process, because at this point the discussion paper is more of a potential than an actual, I think, gain. But with that being said, I think it's a good way to get into a more specific discussion that I know Peter will masterfully guide us through. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Justinas. And Peter, I think you should be able to share your screen. You're currently muted, by the way.
Just a second, I'll get the presentation up.
Yep.
Why can't I find there? Are you seeing my presentation?
Yep. It's
okay.
Not full screen right now, but that's not a problem.
Yeah. See if I can make it full screen. And now it should be full screen.
Nope.
And you're seeing it okay?
We're seeing it fine either way. I think we can continue like this anyhow.
But is it full screen now?
Nope, not right now.
Interesting. Why can't I make that happen? See what happens if it's not quite the... I can see that I'm sharing, but I'm not sure why I.
I think we can proceed like this. Everything's perfectly visible, so.
Okay, because
Shouldn't be a
normally
problem.
I would see the screen and then I would also see some of you, but basically now I just see the screen. But I'll just go with that then.
Mhm.
Okay, so now you've already, well, again, I just want to initially say thank you for inviting me to this webinar, and also thank you for the initial invitation to take part in the discussion that provided the input for the paper that has just been described. I agree with the previous speaker that I think that it's also very important that the Baltic Sea states now get together and have a discussion about how they should proceed so that we make the most of the opportunity that we have now been granted with the entry of Sweden and Finland to the NATO alliance. I think that gives us an opportunity to enhance security for all in the Baltic Sea. But if we do not proceed smartly and have and also take the position of Russia into account, we could end up in a worse situation with less security for all. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and try to give my take on how the Baltic Sea states should proceed in order to make the most of the situation that has now been created. Of course, it's all happening against a very tragic background with the full-scale war that we see unfolding in the Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of fatalities. But it also provides an opportunity for us because it has completely fundamentally changed the geopolitical situation in the Baltic Sea region. We now see Germany realizing that it needs to spend more on defense. We have Sweden and Finland joining the NATO alliance, and we also see the Russian conventional capability to use offensive force being degraded by the day, basically. The Russians have lost a lot of personnel and also material in the Ukraine, and they are likely to lose a lot more before the war is over. And that also means that Russia, when this is over, will pose less of a conventional threat to the Baltic Sea states. And it also means that instead of worrying about making NATO deterrence credible and and potent enough to deter a Russian attack, we also not have to start thinking about how we balance the deterrence of Russia with reassurance that we will not use the weaknesses that are now occurring on the Russian side to take advantage of them or to attack them. And of course, this is self-evident that the NATO countries would not want to do that, but it may not be self-evident in Moscow. The first thing I think that we need to start thinking about is the fact that now that Finland and Sweden is joining the alliance, then we need to rethink our defense plans and also the command structures that currently exist in NATO. And the command, I think there's a general realization inside the NATO alliance that we need to revisit our command structure to make full advantage of the new situation. But it's also quite clear that when you start talking about altering the command structure, this becomes extremely politicized, and there'll be a lot of discussion forth and back at who should be, hosting the command, who should be commanding, and all that sort of stuff. And that's usually extremely difficult to agree upon. And I think for this reason, it is important that all the Baltic states, the Baltic Sea states, start talking to each other about how they should proceed and how they should try and make a consensus among themselves as to what they would want the new command structure to look like. And it's not going to be an easy discussion because, as was already touched upon by the previous speaker, that the Baltic Sea states have different priorities. And if you look at the two maps, of course, there are some of the Baltic Sea states like Finland and Sweden, they'll be very focused on the high north and especially what happens around the Kola Peninsula and northern fleet base that Russia has up there, and arguably that's now going to be even more important for the Russians now that they've basically been now that the Baltic Sea has become an extremely difficult place for the Russian Navy to navigate. If I was Russian naval commander, I would move all my best assets out of the Baltic Sea and up until the Kola Peninsula, for the simple reason that if it was ever come to a war situation, then I think that the Russian Navy would be in very difficult situation and would find it hard to leave Kaliningrad or St. Petersburg. So for that reason, I would take my best assets out of the Baltic Sea. And that may ignite a discussion as to where our priorities should be. Should it be in the Baltic Sea proper, focusing on Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg, or should it be in the high north, focusing on the Kola Peninsula? And for that reason, I think that it's important that the Baltic Sea states find an agreement on this before we open up the discussions, or before they start in earnest in NATO. I think it's if you look around the Baltic Sea, it's quite obvious that all states are now increasing their defense spending. Denmark is really slow getting off the mark. We have just we are about to negotiate a new defense agreement next year, where the target is likely to be that we won't reach 2% until 2033. But we will increase our defense spending, even if not at the same rate as the other Baltic Sea states. But I think it's also important to realize that it's not enough just to spend more. It's also important that the Baltic Sea states coordinate their spending and also coordinate their defense planning, instead of just looking at it from a national perspective and say, now that we're going to get more funds, we would like more on this and more of that. It would be really stupid if the Baltic Sea states now end up procuring a lot of stuff that they don't really need, and that may actually exacerbate the situation rather than improve it. So for that reason, I think that it's really important also, and this is one of the reasons why I like this project, that it is important that the Baltic Sea states now coordinate better than they have in the past. And we actually have an opportunity now that we all have to spend considerably greater funds on defense, to do it wisely and in a regional setting rather than from a purely national perspective. Another key point that I think needs to be highlighted is the fact that, of course, we need to do more to improve deterrence, but we need to match it with reassurance. When you do the regional balance of forces, taking into account the losses that Russia is now suffering, then it's quite clear that NATO has become even more powerful than it was prior to the war. And it also seems likely that and once NATO has implemented the new force model and created a rapid reaction force of some 300,000 personnel, then NATO countries around the Baltic should also be able to match Russia when it comes to mobilization speed, something we have not been able to do up until now. That has been Russia's key advantage, that they were able to mass a great number of soldiers on the borders of the Baltic states quicker than NATO was able to respond. That is probably going to change within the next decade. But as we increase our capacity to mass troops on the Russian border and to mass them close to St. Petersburg, we also need to bear in mind that that may actually look threatening from the Russian perspective. Up until now, NATO has not looked threatening at all in the Baltic Sea state, because Russia was able to mass so many more soldiers than we were at a very short notice. And now that we can do that also, we need to bear in mind that a much weaker Russia is not necessarily a less dangerous Russia, and a weakened Russia may be more inclined to suffer from paranoia, miscalculation, and perhaps even get into a situation where they might be contemplating launching a preemptive strike against NATO out of fear that we might use a major exercise to launch a surprise attack on Russia. And that might sound ludicrous to you, but if you go back and look at Cold War history, you may be aware that that was actually close to become a reality in 1983, when Moscow, for some reason, believed that a NATO exercise was going to serve as a pretext for a surprise attack upon the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union at the time could suffer from such solutions, there's no reason why a weakened Russian leadership sometimes in the future could not end up in the same situation, unless we take care to make sure that Russia should not get such an impression. So, and that of course speaks into the security dilemma. And therefore, I think that we also need to take this defense-offense balance into account. And of course, the more NATO countries around the Baltic Sea states procure and acquire systems that are useful for deep strike inside Russia and can be used to sustain offensive operations, the more likely a Russian negative response or miscalculation is going to be. And therefore, I think that one would also enhance regional security if we focus on so-called defensive systems rather than offensive systems. And of course, I'm quite aware that all systems can either serve defense or offense, depending on how they are combined with other systems. But having said that, I think it's self-evident that if you increase your, if you build up your air defense and your missile defense, then you are more likely to or less likely to trigger a negative response from Moscow than if you increase your investments in long-range strike systems, F-35s, and that sort of stuff. And of course, something that Russia would also view as extremely threatening would be a major increase of NATO forward employment, say in the Baltic states or elsewhere. So in that sense, that needs to be figured into the discussions that we are going to have about how we should now configure our forces in the region. In order to match our increased deterrence that will be necessary, we also need to supplement that with confidence and security building measures. And therefore, I would certainly encourage all Baltic Sea states to increase their military-to-military lines of communication with Russians, and also reopen them if they have been shut down, which is actually the case with respect to Denmark. I'm not suggesting we should do this while the war is still ongoing in the Ukraine, but if we look beyond the war and again focus on this part of Europe and our region, I think that we need to look into this and open up direct communication with the Russian military, as we also had during the Cold War. And I also think that it's important to bear in mind that NATO will be operating from a position of strength and not weakness. NATO is now by far more powerful than Russia is, and it will be even more powerful, relatively speaking, after the Ukraine war for a considerable period of time. And NATO needs to bear this into mind when they configure their forces in the region. There's also another thing that I think that the Baltic Sea states would be well advised to bear in mind already at this point. As the European NATO members build up their conventional forces in terms of material and also personnel, I think the unavoidable consequence will be that the US will use this opportunity to move more forces to Asia. So when the Europeans build up their forces in an attempt to retain the US security guarantee and to ensure that the Americans stay engaged in Europe, I think the paradoxical result will be that the US is going to conclude that, hey, we don't need that much of a presence in Europe anymore, because now the Europeans are more than strong enough to deal with the Russians on their own. And I think that the US will draw the following conclusion from the Ukraine war, that see how much we can actually do by simply providing target intelligence information, target information, and supporting the war in the air. And then we can leave the rest to the locals, meaning that NATO Europeans will become the Ukrainians in future confrontations with the Russia. I think that of course, I know the counter argument that we should start preparing for this situation, that if we do so, then the US will just leave sooner rather than later. But I think that the US is going to leave in any event. And therefore, I think we need to start thinking about how can we actually credibly deter Russia conventionally without the US, and probably also the UK, because I see the UK being overstretched. I see them having huge internal difficulties, a possible I think that one has to be very aware of the fact that Scotland might actually leave the United Kingdom, and for that reason, I don't think that the UK presence can be taken for granted in the Baltic Sea region. So for that reason, I think that the Baltic Sea states need to start thinking about the future where the US and UK presence will be minimal in terms of conventional forces. I'm not saying that we should that the nuclear umbrella is not going to remain important. Of course it is, but I don't think that we can take their conventional military presence for granted. And that was my remarks, and I'll shut up now and open it up for your questions.
Right. Thank you for your talk. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, you can either use the question and answer section or the chat, which I've reopened. Meanwhile, we did get a question. I'll just read it off directly and explain how I think what direction it goes in. You have mentioned the danger that NATO expansion in the north could have for Lithuania. Could you please expand in your view on how Lithuania should approach these probable threats? So I assume it's related to the possible refocusing onto the Kola Peninsula. I think it was in reference to Justinas's talk, but if you have anything to add to that, Peter, you're welcome to as well. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure, rather, I think that I did not use the word danger because there is not necessarily a danger as much as it is a new consideration to be had, that there are, well, I mean, it just, every theater has its own functional issues that involve security but also extend far beyond, and the increasing importance of the Arctic as a geopolitical stage will not negate its profound importance to the global ecosystems, for example, which are very highly salient concerns in the Nordics, especially in Sweden and Finland and Norway, and meaning that while any sort of NATO strategy in the high north and the Baltics and I guess generally the global northeast and the global north and the global northwest will stem from the same basic value, same basic interest. There will be differences in how specific cooperation with non-NATO countries are constructed, and the Baltics in some cases, I think, because they're not as close participants in the theater, will have to see in what ways they can be constructive supporters of the more specific pressing issue-specific preferences of their, let's say, Nordic allies. That was my main point. It's not so much that that the expansion of the NATO horizons up north create specific dangers to the Baltics. The point is that they'll have to sort of find their supportive and constructive role to engage the partners. So yeah, and then on the Kola Peninsula, etc., I think I'll revert it back to Peter because he had both the map and an extensive point about that.
Yeah, if I can just follow on, I think that what the question really also addresses a concern that I have in relation to the need to coordinate regionally and also to think through how should we set up the NATO command structure for this particular region, because there will be very distinct issues when we're looking at problems around the Kola Peninsula, and then also operations around, say, St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. They're two very separate issues, but they still have to be, handled by the same command structure. And therefore, it's important that the regional countries think through how they're going to play this. But I also think that it may also speak to another thing that I said, the danger that the US will not be that interested in operating in the Baltic Sea with its navy anymore. I think there's no risk of US disengagement and abandonment in the high north, because they will continuously be focused on the Kola Peninsula, because that's where Russia has most of its second strike capability that is sea-based. They have the submarines there, and they also have some surface platforms that can carry nuclear weapons. And for that reason, they'll remain a high priority for the Americans. So the risk of relative US abandonment is not high with respect to the Kola Peninsula. That applies only to the Baltic Sea with respect to naval assets. And I think that's also where you could see some sort of intra-NATO division of labor. But I think it's important that it is thought through rather than happening ad hoc.
Okay, and we have one more question here. Let me just open it up again. Right, so it's from Melvin Youngenellis. This is a question to Peter. NATO has multiple multinational battle groups in the Baltics. At what point are we over deterring Russia, and are there any indicators that, indicate that we are?
Well, that's a very good question. And if I was asking a representative from the Baltic states, I'm sure that they would say that we are definitely by no means over deterring Russia, and that they would actually like an increased conventional, frontline presence by NATO. And that's also what they've been calling for in response to the Ukrainian war. So at the moment, I would not argue that we are over deterring Russia. I was more looking at the situation beyond this war. We still do not know how exactly the war ends in the Ukraine, but my guess will still be that we'll be looking at a Russia that is that is a lot weaker conventionally than we've been used to prior to the start of this war. And I think that the Ukrainian forces will also bind a large number of Russian military personnel that will have to guard the Russian-Ukrainian border, no matter how it ends up existing after the end of the war. And for that reason, I think that there will be less military presence in and around the Baltic Sea area. And I think one has to take that into account when one goes through the numbers of how much does NATO actually need. And my sense is that we probably do not need more conventional forces close to the Russian border than we currently have. But what we do need is an infrastructure and an ability to move forces much quicker into the Baltic states and Poland that we have been able to do prior to this war. So I think that we should continue to work on enhancing our ability to move forces very, very quickly into the Baltic states and Poland, and perhaps store more equipment and so on and so forth, so that we at short notice can put more forces into the Baltic Sea states than we could prior to the war. So that I would try to find this balance by not putting more forces close to the Russian border on a permanent basis, but I would beef up our ability to get forces to the right places at the right time in the future. And then I would also beef off our missile and air and drone defense. And if we do that, I think we could have a credible deterrent posture that would not make Russia unnecessarily worried. But so it's that sort of balance that I think we need to look at when we look beyond the war and we look at the new situation. But for the moment, I would not say that we are over deterring Russia, but I think that risk may come to pass in the future if we are not careful about how we manage our forces as we move forward.
Okay, thank you. Following up on that, while we wait for more questions, I'll abuse my right as the moderator. Of course, we're talking over deterrence. What would you say about Lithuania's push for the German brigade in Lithuania, of course, because for us, it's a very big thing. We're really looking forward to having that. How would you place that in this regard?
Well, if it's just a matter of one brigade, then it's probably doable. But again, I think that if you if you establish a new brigade, I think you should also think about, is there then something else that you don't need? It's about the overall number and the overall posture, and I think that's what you should keep in mind. I do see the logic of trying to make that push, but it's also something that started before this war started. And therefore, I think that we need to look at the situation again and see, now we have a fundamentally new situation. How can we best, manage this new situation? And that'll mean then some of the things that we had been planning to do before this war erupted and before Russia suffered the losses that it now currently suffers, that means that they may no longer be the best thing to do. So I think that we should look at the whole setup again and ask, what do we actually need in the new situation? What do we need less of, and what do we need more of? So I think that's the way to approach it. For instance, we're also now talking about procuring a new battleships in Denmark, also for the Baltic Sea. I'm not sure that's a great idea now, looking at the new situation. I think we might do better by investing in something else. So I think that we should also revisit the procurement plans and the defense plans that we had February of this year, and ask, are they still relevant? Should they be refined, or is there now something that we can see in the Ukraine that may mean that we should rethink some of the procurement that we were thinking about? And certainly, if you're looking at the importance of air defense, missile defense, and defense against drones, I certainly think that there's something that we should reconsider in Denmark that we hadn't necessarily given the priority that we ought to, now that we see what's going on in the Ukraine. So I think that we need to revisit our national defense plans, but also our regional defense plans. And we need to take this new knowledge with us when we start discussing how we should arrange NATO forces around the area and also set up a new command structure.
Okay, thank you. Justinas, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, well, I think my understanding of the discussion surrounding the German brigade in Lithuania is that it falls in line with both the practical need to in the 5-year period, is I think where my horizon ends right now, to make sure that the Baltic states and Lithuania specifically is more easily accessible by its allies. So in that sense, it's a constructive and it's a constructive step consistent with the direction about which the paper spoke, about which Peter just spoke now. That's my understanding. But also it is, I think, a move consistent with the regional direction vis-a-vis the global trends, and specifically with the changing presence of the US in the region. In that sense, I think it's also a welcome development. Whether it fulfills its promises or not, that's a separate discussion. It seems like it should, but I think it is consistent with what the overall paper, although in a slightly more abstract maybe terms, was speaking, and in that sense, welcome.
Okay.
Yes, enough. And just to add that, I think that's, and it also speaks to the need to begin to prepare for a situation where we may not be able to rely on the British coming here. In the sense that if we can replace British and American forces with German, Polish, and other forces, and then use the build-up that they're now saying that they're going to go through, and they're saying they're going to spend a massive amount on weapons and personnel, and if we have become strong enough to be able to manage the situation in the Baltic Sea without the Americans and without the British, I think that would actually also have a positive impact, because if you look back, you can see that Russia is clearly more annoyed about non-Baltic states being present and operating in the Baltic Sea than Baltic sea states. So in that sense, that might actually also have a reassuring impact. But of course, it has to be done in in a way that does not create big holes into our deterrence posture. It has to be managed careful, and we are talking about things that are now going to take decades probably. So I'm not saying that we should start doing something different tomorrow, but I'm saying that we should begin to think about how can we actually create a situation where we enhance the security for all of us instead of creating dangerous situations.
Okay. And follow-up from Mr. Young and Elias. This is to Peter, but I think Justinas might want to answer as well afterwards. How do you view the international forces coming into the Baltics on a bilateral basis and not under the NATO flag, which is not necessarily then integrated in NATO planning? What risks are there in this? And of course, you've mentioned that it annoys Russia more that the people are coming from outside the Baltics.
Well, in an ideal world, it should all be managed by Brussels. In the real world, things in Brussels take time, and there has been a need for stopgap measures. And I've also seen the British JEF force, a Joint Expeditionary Force, being something different from NATO, but still within NATO as playing a useful role as a gap filler. So I certainly understand why the Baltic states and others have been wanting to get these bilateral agreements with the US and UK and France and others in order to get an additional measure of security, which was clearly needed prior to the ongoing war. But I think that we should work towards, doing it as much as we can within through the NATO structure. But at the same time, I'm not so naive as to think that we need not to supplement it with bilateral agreements. So the key is really to manage the two so that they reinforce one another instead of undermining each other. And I'm actually not that worried about stronger regional cooperation within NATO. I know that regionalization is a bad word in NATO setting because people say, oh, but then the southern countries will only focus on the south and the northern countries will only focus on their region and so on and so forth. But I don't think there's anything wrong with regional nations sharing the same threat assessment, coming together and doing intensified cooperation, as long as they are also cognizant of their obligations in NATO and make sure that their arrangements, plug and play with the NATO arrangement. And I think that is doable, and I think that it has been made to work so far, and I don't see why it should not be able to, that we should not be able to do so in the future as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can only add 2 points. One is that while agreeing with I think the general gist of what Peter just said, related to the bilateral versus collective arrangements, is that most of the bilateral arrangements come because for practical considerations they're faster, they're maybe more easily arrangeable and implemented when interests align. So in a certain sense, it's a sort of what realism demands. It's a more practical, stopgap measure, quote unquote. But there's also, I think, a very important political sort of tactical component to it. You sometimes want to deepen bilateral relations in security because of security considerations, but also because of broader political arrangements. I think that it is a great benefit to the overall political attitudes towards the old Europe, for example, in Lithuania, that Germany is such a strong bilateral partner to Lithuania. And it's great that the UK, which is so important to all the 3 Baltic states, for example, because of their migrant populations in the UK, that we have a strong, robust bilateral relationship there. So I think these questions will always transcend a little bit the security considerations, but within the security domain, they remain practically important. So they shouldn't be ideologically opposed to. But I do think that, yes, a more integrated, a more institutionalized collective security system is probably the preferred ideal arrangement. And then the second point about regionalization, I think, the overall stance that I tried to convey in the paper and that I saw during the discussions is there's a lot that intra-regional cooperation, greater intra-regional cooperation can achieve, and thus it should be pursued, but it must be all of these intra-regional defense integration initiatives should remain open. it's not so much regionalization where you develop a much stronger shared assessment and a much closer sort of, integrated, for example, defense industrial capability or so, but that you don't prevent anybody else from accessing it. And I think, we see a similar argument on a larger scale when we come to EU defense integration, whether it should allow third-party access in it, for example, defense industrial schemes that favor joint project. So I think that's probably where the line is drawn, rather than should we go for more thinking as a region? Yes, we should, but should that be at the expense of our partners, have a certain sense or a certain access to the region? It shouldn't. So I think that's probably the line between regionalization and greater regional cooperation. And I think that's by and large non-controversial. We don't want to exclude any of our partners necessarily, but we do want to go further where it is better to go further together.
Well, with that, our hour is up. Peter, Justinas, would you have any final remarks that you'd like to point out? Nope. In that case, I thank all our guests who listened in to us for this hour. I thank Justinas and Peter for joining in and sharing their thoughts. Hopefully, we will be organizing the second Building Baltic Consensus event next year. And we'll see how it all works out. Of course, there's the summit too that we have to look forward to. So for the time being, have a lovely Friday, and until next time.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.